Hello friends, welcome to Code Slate. In this lesson, we will see how to use SpringBoot OAuth2 client to integrate our SpringBoot application with Keycloak. So the SpringBoot application that we will be developing is a client which will be authenticated using Keycloak. To understand better, let's look at the sequence diagram. The sequence diagram, as you can see here, we have Springboot application which provides an UI which can be accessed through browser, and this Springboot application is integrated with Keycloak. Keycloak is nothing but a open source identity and access management solution. It provides out-of-box authentication and authorization services, as well as user federation, identity brokering, social login. So authentication part, Keycloak will take care. We don't need to implement in Springboot. Only thing we need to do is we integrate our Springboot application with Keycloak. So we will be implementing a Springboot application whenever a user through a browser try to access a Springboot application, as user is not authenticated or user is not logged in, it will redirect to Keycloak login page. And once we enter the credentials for the user, it will be submitted to Keycloak. Keycloak verify the user credential, provide an auth code, and then using the auth code, the Springboot application will get back the token. Once the user is authenticated, then we will actually display the application page. So let's get started with this. First of all, we'll configure the Keycloak, the users, the client, and the realm. Once we configure the Keycloak, we'll develop the Springboot application and develop and configure the Springboot application to integrate with Keycloak. So let's start with Keycloak. So I download the Keycloak from the I'll show it. I download the Keycloak from keycloak.org. So here you can download Keycloak. So I download the Quaker's distribution, which is zip file. Once you download, unzip that, and then go to the bin directory. So you will see different commands. So use KC to start the Keycloak, and by default Keycloak starts on 8080 port. So I'll use dev profile to start the Keycloak. So in this Keycloak server, I pre-created the user, but otherwise when you first time start, it asks for the creation of admin user. I have already created the here. So when you go back here, you log in as an admin. Once you log in as an admin, you create a new realm. I created a realm called Springboot, and then under this realm we have clients. So create a new client. I have pre-created a client called demo client, which is a public client. So, and also the redirect, when the user is authenticated, the Keycloak redirects the page to application page. That is nothing but our Springboot application page. So I configured realm, I created a new client and also an user called test user. So this is a user I've created. Now I should be able to log into my application using the test user. So this is the end for the. So this is all about the Keycloak configuration. Let's go back to our application. We'll develop a new Springboot application which uses a Keycloak to log in. So let's go back to the application. I created a Springboot sample Springboot application with application file and then controller. I've not added anything, but and we have the application properties where we'll configure. So before that, we go back to the build. So here I need to add a dependency. The dependency is for the client library and also TimeLeaf. So we will serve the UI through TimeLeaf. So let's add the dependencies. First dependency is so I'm adding, this is the library which auto configures our Springboot application to talk to the provider. So the provider is our OAuth provider is Keycloak for us. So it can be configured to talk to Google or GitHub or some other provider. So we are configuring to talk to the Keycloak. So I'm also want TimeLeaf so that I can use TimeLeaf to create an UI for us to display the page. So this ends with the build.gradle. So I configured the dependencies needed. Then I'll go back to the application. So we need to configure two things here. One is client, OAuth client and OAuth provider. So I'll just configure that. And then under security, so this is a security OAuth2 client, and then I need to register the client. My client here is Keycloak. So if you want Google to be your auth provider, you can just replace with Keycloak with Google and provide the client ID, client secret. But I want to use Keycloak as my auth provider. So see here, this is the, I also need to configure client ID, which I created in the Keycloak earlier. So here, this is a client ID which I created. So I'm configuring that client ID. And then the secrets, I created a client secret as demo app that I can show here. So I created a client with client secret as demo app, and then client name is Keycloak. So this is what I'm using, and then authorization grant type is auth code. So the authorization grant type is auth code as I showed here earlier. So just I'll go back to the diagram. Yeah. So here the sequence, you can see this whole the whole flow is called authorization code, because we are getting the auth code and then use that auth code to get the token. So this flow, as per the OAuth2 standard, it's an authorization code flow. There are different code flow. We are using authorization code flow here in this case. So I have configured the registration for the Keycloak, and now I need to configure the provider. The provider is nothing but it's a, here I am configure auto discovery for the provider. I need to be at the same level as registration. So if you see here, the provider is nothing but a Keycloak. So we need to configure registration and provider. Registration is client registration, and the provider is actual OAuth provider. So I'm saying it's a Keycloak. Provider name is Keycloak, and the issuer URL. Issuer URL is nothing but a discovery URI. So this URL is used by our Springboot application to discover all the endpoints that a Keycloak provides. Not only endpoints, it's also all the security related configurations, like what is the encryption used, all that information is discovered. So in our case, the library will discover as part of configuration, auto configuration, all the URLs, and then use some of them for our code flow. So we are done with application. Then we'll go back to the user controller. I need to configure my user controller so that I can display the my time leaf application. So basically I'll start with index page. So it's a controller. It's look at this, it's a controller, not the REST controller, because I need to use time leaf to display the UI. I just creating the index page for the time leaf. So I'm setting some of the attributes like username, client name, and scope. So username is nothing but the user I am logged in, and then the client information that I'm using to authenticate with the Keycloak. So if you see here, we are injecting OAuth2 user, that is the user who has logged into my Springboot application, as well as token. So the token that we receive here, the token that we receive is injected in this. So the token has some information which can be used to display the which can be used to display, and I also need some information from the OAuth2 client. So that information we can get from the authorization client service. So I'll just auto add that. I use some I can get tracked from the token. So I'll write a method to get the authorization client from the token, from this authorization token. So once I have authorization token, I can get the client. So the client contains some information that we have created. So we can get the client. We also have all the information. We have the client information. We have the authenticated user and also token. So I'm just displaying all the information that is available for an authenticated session. So all these are the information, some of the information. So we'll go back to our time leaf. So let's go back to the time leaf. Just right header. So I'm not using the Spring Security here, but Spring Security 5, but I want to keep it so that we can use in the later lessons. I'll just write the body. So what I'm doing is I'm displaying the username, the logged in user, client name, and the scopes that we get back from the client. So if you see the controller, I have set the model username, that is from the authentication, that the token has that information. If you get the get principal and then get attributes or the preferred username, we can get the username, and also client name from the authorization client and client ID. So this is a client name that I have registered with the Keycloak, and the scopes for the authorization client. So these are some of the information that I got after I authenticate with the Keycloak. So I'm displaying just that information in a time leaf application. Now go back, we'll run this application. That's all from this application. We go back and run the application. So let's start the application. I want to log out of admin so that it is much clearer what we are doing. So let's start the application. Oh, sorry, boot run. So if you see, we have configured our Springboot application to run on 8081, but our Keycloak is already running on 8080. I am starting my Springboot application on 8081. So my application has started, and then it is listening on 8081 port. So let me access the application. So when I access the application, as a user is not logged in, it redirect us to the Keycloak. So once we enter the username and password, and it's authenticated, and then actual Spring Boot application page is displayed only when we have proper username and password. So let's go back to our application. So this is our application page, or we can also use index.php. So when I logged in the application, if you see here, it is redirected to the Springboot, redirected to Keycloak for us to authenticate. Once we enter proper username, not the admin, because we redirected to the Springboot realm. So Springboot realm, if you remember, we have created a user called test user, and that user has to be used to log into the Springboot realm. So it's a test user. I have created the password, so I'm entering. So these are the user credentials that I was talking to be entered, and then that credentials are sent to the Keycloak because the login page is from the Keycloak. So once I sign in, it goes back to the user to the Spring Boot application. This process. So in the background, it sent the key credentials to the Keycloak, and then got the auth code, and then it sent to the app with the auth code. So once the authentication code is retrieved from the browser, Spring Boot application sends that authentication code to the Keycloak, and once it gets a Keycloak access token and token refresh token, the display we will be able to display. So as the user is authenticated, we are displaying. So if you see here, the user is test user, the client name is demo app, and the scopes are OpenID and email profile. So these are the users which this is the user which we logged in. So we'll go back and show you again. Here now, if you see here, the realm is master. So but here when we logged into our application, that is Spring Boot realm. So this is admin user. So I'm just logging with the admin user I want to admin user, and then this is a realm, and then in the clients. So this is our demo app. If you can, we can also see who has logged in, and if you go back to the sessions and then show sessions, so you can see here the test user. Someone with test user has logged into this logged in to the demo app client. So this is the user which we used to log into the Spring Boot application, and then you can see this is displayed here as well. So test user, demo client. Yeah, this is how we can use Keycloak as auth provider and to log into the to our Spring Boot application. So recap, what we have done is we used OAuth2 client library to auto configure our Spring Boot application. When this library is used, it provides an auto configuration to our Spring Boot application, so that we can integrate with Keycloak, which is an OpenID Connect provider. And the flow, OAuth flow which we used is nothing but authentication code flow, or auth code flow. So where we where we submit the credential, get back the auth code, and then use the auth code to get the access token. So this is the flow we demonstrated. So we have used the library for auto configuration, and then after that we configured the registration or Keycloak client registration, this client ID secret, and then the grant type, what authorization we use, authorization code grant type, and then redirect URL. So this URL is nothing but the application URL, not the Keycloak URL. When the Keycloak does the authentication is done, the login page is redirected to the application. So you need to give that you redirect URI page, URI as like this, like login OAuth2 code demo app. So this is the format we have to give, and then we also need to configure the provider, that is a Springboot. This is a client which so this is used by our Springboot application to auto discover the URLs of the Springboot. So the auto discovery URL is formed from this. So actually the auto discovery URL I can show you on that. So yeah, this is the auto discovery URL. If you see here, it's a from here it will be well known, and then this is a standard, and then we auto discover all the information, all the security information and the URLs which is needed by Springboot application to connect to the Keycloak. The one I can show you is like this one. So Keycloak uses this API or this endpoint of the our Springboot application uses this endpoint of Keycloak to get the token from the Keycloak. If you go back to the sequence diagram, this request number 6 is performed using this. So all these URLs needed by the Springboot application is auto discovered from the Keycloak. And then what we did is we configured the user controller, all the information that has to be displayed in our page, UI page. So I have got those information from the token as well as auth user and configured there. And then finally we have written the timely UI where we display the information that banking bean provides, and then we display that. That's it from this lesson. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next lesson.